Hey everybody, this is Ryan McClanahan with historythroughcards.com. Hope you're all doing very well today. This video, I'm going to tell you about one of our hobby pioneers, Wirt Gammon Sr., and he's really interesting. He's actually a sports reporter going back to 1930, and he's also a hobby pioneer. He was writing articles in magazines about sports cards specifically. He tended to talk a lot about the T205s, T206s, your tobacco cards, and he started that about 1945. I think that's maybe the earliest date that I could find in his hobby writing. He was prolific, almost as prolific, or probably more so than Lionel Carter. And Lionel Carter had a 70-year career as a writer for the hobby, and he was a banker. So, unlike uh, Lionel Carter, Wirt Gammon Sr. was an established writer for an established newspaper at the Chattanooga Times. He was collecting sports cards in 1910 or so, 1911, 1912, and I think he even had a T206 Wagner at one point in time. His collection, though, is a little bit on the mysterious side. I'm not really entirely sure what he had in his collection. Today, I wanted to kind of share with you some of his articles and his writing style, and you're gonna kind of like pick up on something really interesting. I am going to share with you one of his articles in the Ball Card Collector from 1971, where he's talking about his time collecting the T205s, I believe, or T206s. One of those. Again, he is a contemporary of uh, Lionel Carter directly as a writer, but he's also a contemporary of Jefferson Burdick too. He's a little bit younger than Jefferson Burdick and John D. Wagner, about 5 years. So he was born in 1905 and he passed away in 1985. In these articles, I think you're going to find it really interesting. And I want to hear what you guys have to say about this at the end. I'll come back and talk to you a little bit more about this afterwards, but I think you're going to find this really interesting. This is from the Chattanooga Daily Times, April 26th, 1953. Wirt Gammon gets Sports Sermons Award by Stoney Jackson, author of Sports Sermon, a religious magazine feature, and director of Christian Athletes Foundation with headquarters in Tullahoma, Tennessee. Many of the best sports writers are extremely reluctant to allow anything to appear on the pages of their paper that is auditory to them personally. And there is good reason for that policy, in addition to a naturally retiring nature that belongs to many writers, those whose business is it to write about sports characters for the daily press run into so many who are out and out publicity seekers and whose playing to the gallery comes to have a somewhat nauseous aroma to the sensitive souls that inhabit the bodies of numerous writers. Then, too, this is the day when the idea has become accepted that a good and constant flow of press notices is essential to the success of anyone who appears or would appear before the public, that press agents are retained by athletic organizations, actors, politicians, and sometimes businessmen who are trying to get ahead. In many instances, it is essential that in numerous cases, adept handling of publicity has been the secret of the names you would recognize instantly because of the amount of copy you have read about them. But writers usually see these build ups taking place and too often know how very much of the true story of this that and the other public figure is sheer fiction created by the active mind of an eager press agent. All these facts tend to make the writer a bit shy of publicity concerning himself, particularly when it is to appear on the pages he edits. So, in instances such as the presenting of an award for the exhibition of quote unquote Christian sportsmanship in the writing of sports to Wirt Gammon, the editor of the Times sports section, this columnist invites himself to be a guest writer for the day of presentation. Such is the case concerning this column. For the past 5 years, along with awards to outstanding athletes who are outstanding in their sportsmanship and general example and influence, Sports Sermon has selected for the Christian Athletes Foundation a sports writer each year who is most deserving of such an award for the general tone of his writing, particularly referring to his regular column. Some time ago, Wirt Gammon wrote a column urging fans to be sportsmanlike in their attitude towards a Chattanooga player who was trying to make the grade in the face of several handicaps. That particular column struck home here, and Mr. Gammon's writing was watched with particular interest for quite some period, and was then decided that he was most deserving of the honor for 1952. Along with numerous others, he was invited to attend a dinner in Florida the early part of this year to receive this award. That dinner was called off due to the illness of the columnist, and so the football awards and some others are being made sectionally prior to the proposed trip to Korea, for which travel instructions, passport, and visa are being awaited while undergoing numerous immunization shots, far too numerous. Today, the award was presented to Wirt very simply and unobtrusively at the offices of the Chattanooga Times. Wirt Gammon's wholesome interest in good sportsmanship is particularly valuable in a time when we have lost so much of our perspective in sports, and when we need perhaps more than anything else in the world is to regain a proper sense of values. Many by now are decrying our present philosophy in sports of winning at all cost. It is a constant source of irritation to me, and I'm certain it is to other football officials and boxing officials, that coaches and managers almost never ask what is right and the most sportsmanlike thing under any play situation, but usually ask, here is what I'm teaching my boys to do this year. Can I get by with it? So and so is doing the same thing, or worse. Well, the thing that is responsible for this attitude in sports is our general materialistic philosophy in this generation, which cries out to all, succeed at all costs. Succeed materially first, and then you can have the time and means to do other things. Time enough to be honest and play the game of life in a sportsmanlike manner when you have got all your money made. It's the only safe way. I know many who have struggled along for years with honesty and character coming before money, or they would very much like to be wealthy, as most of us would, but they weren't willing to violate their own integrity to do it. But they aren't looked up to by many or sought out by them in your own town or mine. They are the failures because they are broke, in debt, or both, and they can't borrow any money on their character. I hear the most respected families, leaders in church, as well as other endeavors, when daughter goes courting with some appearance of seriousness, inquire before all things as to what sort of financial security and social standing the young fellow has, and whether he can give daughter the material comfort everyone seems to think so necessary. It would be nice if the man had some character too, but it isn't the first consideration. Well, don't blame the coaches. We, the sporting public, have set the standard, and only we can place it back where it should be. I'm not a bit worried about what one or two platoons would do to football. I'm worried about what the win at all cost philosophy will do to it. I'd rather win than eat. I don't think a man ought to compete without wanting to win, but some prices are too high to pay. I'm not worried about what the atom bomb will do to us, but I'm very much worried about what our philosophy is doing to us. So keep up the good work, Wirt Gammon, and may the writing and the sense of values maintained by you and others like you help us find a truer set of values. God bless your efforts, for when true sportsmanship is the standard here at home first, then will we begin to see world sportsmanship. Without it, we need to look for more enduring peace. With it, we'll have to pray so hard for heaven in the next life, for we will have some basis of familiarity with it here and now. And that's from C.E. Stoney Jackson. This is from the January 1971 edition of the Ball Card Collector. Specifically, it's from the collection of David Kathman, who is a really, really good researcher and probably one of the best I think that I've seen in a long, long time. And that's actually saying something. But anyway, this is Gammon's Corner, and it states Roseville, Georgia. I am glad Mr. Sterling in Coffin Corner of the last issue of BCC mentioned that cigarette advertising on baseball cards was once in Hans Wagner's day the main medium of cigarette advertising, and also produced what must be the favorite sets of most collectors. And now that cigarette ads are off TV, why not go back to the baseball cards? Sterling asks with a timely query. Surely the idea has merit. Cigarette firms are turning to sponsoring sports events. I read to sponsoring bowling, women's tennis, and auto racing events. That is nice, but isn't that just a step away from following up with inserting cards showing the athletes? Possibly. The fascinating thing about the way cigarettes once went whole hog for insert cards in advertising is that, according to advertising history articles I have, this is actually the method cigarettes used to launch from the unknown into popularity. It worked like a charm, starting with the Old Judge, number 172's Goodwin, just before the turn of the century. When the T205 and T206 began around 1910, I was only 5 years old, and I can remember back when I was about seven that these cards began to appear everywhere. Many smokers collected them; if not, their children collected the bright colored pictures, often begging parents to buy a pack. Salesboys, eh? If not, a smoker would open a pack and throw the card away. It was nothing to walk down the street and see a baseball cigarette card on the sidewalk or the edge of the road or edge of a yard. Looking back on it, I can see that this very fact of finding desirable cards on a walk downtown was a big boost to the tobacco trade. What better reminders of a product could you imagine in those days before color ads in newspapers or magazines and TV? It was always somehow startling to chance upon these old cards. Happily, you would sometimes find one you didn't have or hadn't even seen before. There were no catalogs and checklists then. Remember, they came many, many years later, 1937 to be exact. I remember the excitement when the first T205 appeared. The T206 had flooded the country, no doubt. I say that, one, because all kids had some, though no one had what he thought was a complete set, and two, because these are still turning up by the thousands. Only a few days ago, a man where I work bought an attic load of old items, and in it were several thousand T206. You need any? Also, in the lot were some E254, T210, and T330-2. The last attracts me a lot. Possibly they were issued at the height of my youthful interest in these cards. I could be tempted to branch out into T330, 6, and 7. Have you noticed that some sets like T210 emphasize the minor league towns of the South Atlantic area? And you realize, of course, that this is because of the tobacco industry being centered there. Some mighty small towns of that southern area got players on cards. This gives a clue to the popularity of the cards then and the tremendous advertising value. I wonder how many millions of smokers were made by cigarette cards and how many extra packs were sold by the cards. Back to the history of advertising, that is, advertising on the items given away in the 1800s. Pamphlets came first, then messages and pictures began appearing on wrapping paper, labels, cardboard boxes, calendars, street music, plugging products was even given away. Almost by accident, advertising by cigarette cards was born. Cigarettes were first packed in very thin, flimsy wrapping paper that was around the time of the Civil War. To prevent damage, companies started inserting stiffeners in packs. Next, they started printing a few lines of advertising on the cards. They started, of course, with sex appeal. Black and white cards began to show girlies in various stages of light dress. Okay. Horrors, came the cries from moral censors. A leader was the mayor of Charleston, South Carolina, who ordered Duke actors' pictures taken from the pack before the cigarettes were sold. Quickly, the tobacco firms switched to baseball. Soon they went to color and added many other subjects, and it is said that the Broadway hit Oklahoma used the colorful Hassan Cowboy card series to get authentic clothes of earlier days, 1910. Kinney military is rated a standard for historical garb, but baseball was the leader. Baseball was beginning to come on strong. Cigarettes rode the coattails of the sport into acceptance, so to speak. It could help to do so again. So what I think he's referring to there is the Dingley Tariff Act of 1897, and what this did was it banned tobacco inserts in packages of tobacco products, and this wasn't lifted until 1909 with the Payne-Aldrich Tariff Act, and you also had the Copyright Act of 1909 as well, and both those were responsible for establishing the T206 set. There's a lot there. I'm not going to get into it too heavily, too deeply. I've talked about it at great length, in fact, in my look into the T206 and T205s. But these cards were essentially banned in tobacco packages. And at one point in time, it was up to each state to kind of lift that ban on tobacco products, and the last ban was lifted in 1927. And at one point in New York State, in about 1905 or so, you couldn't women couldn't smoke, and if they did smoke, they were subject to arrest or at least a fine. And I think at least one woman was arrested for it, and that didn't work out all that well. So it was kind of crazy though that you had a ban on tobacco products in New York at the same time as that they're banning parimutuel betting and horse racing and banning alcohol as well and boxing too. Well, the alcohol ban was actually implemented state by state first and then nationally in I think 1920. So it's kind of crazy. Bans don't really work. We've seen this time and time again. They just don't. You're looking at human nature here, and if you ban too many things, all you're going to do is create more demand for what you're banning, and that's just the way mankind works. But let's get on to this other article here about Wirt Gammon. This is from the Bristol Herald Courier, Bristol, Tennessee, June 2nd, 1985. Wirt Gammon Missed by Many by Gene Thompson. Tom Seiler and I will miss Wirt Gammon. It's been a while since we ganged up, and the volume press box in Neyland Stadium covered the Vols against Alabama and Auburn in Birmingham's Legion Field, or watched Tennessee collide with Georgia Tech in Atlanta's Bobby Dodd territory, but we kept in touch. Wirt died recently after a long and courageous battle with cancer. He left a void in Tennessee sports. Wirt Gammon had been with the Chattanooga Times since 1930, the last 37 years as sports editor, which featured his factual and down-to-earth column, Just Between Us Fans. He was a native of Bristol, and with his background, it is a wonder he didn't launch a career in politics. He was the son of Dr. L. H. Gammon, twice mayor of Bristol, Tennessee. And consider this, he was the great-great-grandson of immortal patriot Patrick Henry and the great-nephew of Landon C. Haines, noted speaker and a member of the Confederate Senate from East Tennessee. Furthermore, he was a second cousin of Bob and Alf Taylor, both of whom served as governors of Tennessee. I learned much from this from the Times, where it was never one to boast. Wirt got his first real baptism of sports when he went to the University of Virginia. He was there during the era of legendary Greasy Neal. Greasy Neal is in the Football Hall of Fame, and he's a baseball player as well. So you can get a card of Greasy Neal, baseball card that is. He had a fling in both football and baseball, and that did it. He dedicated his life to the world of sports. We used to laugh about our early experience in the newspaper game. He began his career on the Times sports staff at $15 a week. I launched mine on a $12.50 a week basis at the old Moore Street plant of the Herald Courier. I wrote sports, covered a police beat, did special features, and learned to file on the Associated Press teletype. Wirt and I saw each other fairly often, not only in Southern Conference press boxes and at ball games, but at national baseball conventions. He was founder of the Tri-State Umpires and Scorers Association and helped to set up numerous amateur baseball and softball leagues. As a member of the East Ridge Bible Church, he was one of the founders of the Chattanooga chapter of the Fellowship of Christian Athletes. Many honors came his way, but the one he cherished most came back in 1975 when he was enshrined in the Tennessee Sports Hall of Fame, an organization he helped found in 1966. When I followed him into the hall a few years later, he wrote me a letter of congratulations that I treasure. It was typical of Wirt Gammon. Another prestigious honor came to Wirt in 1975 when the National Football Foundation and Hall of Fame voted him its Distinguished Service Award for unselfish contribution to football in his community. Although through it all, Wirt never lost contact with his longtime friends in Bristol. These included Clyde Reeser, who was the first to tell me of his death, and Maurice Kahn, who did an efficient job as Commissioner of Streets in Bristol, Tennessee, and was a sterling three-sport athlete. Buck Johnson, current sports editor of the Times, has this to say: "Let others list the many honors that came his way. Let me talk about the man, the unpretentious soul who was the champion of the little man in sports, but who could equally be at ease with the greatest of personalities. No job was too great or too small for him. He worked in every imaginable setting and was as much at ease in the hot sunshine of Warner Park at a softball game as he would have been in the plush environment of a major league press box." His column, Just Between Us Fans, was appropriate name because he was a true sports fan. Johnson adds, "I leaned closer to hear the weakened voice. I had a good life," he whispered. "It was made easy by the people I met. I just seemed that everyone I've ever been associated with shared my likes and dislikes. I've really been lucky." The Times sports editor continues, "It was the positive influence of Gammon that made the transition from his leadership of nearly 4 decades to the talented Jay Searcy so easy. And Searcy, now the executive sports editor of the Philadelphia Inquirer, has never forgotten. I always had a great respect for him, Searcy said of Gammon when he learned of his death. When I went to work for the Times, I was just a scared kid, but he had a lot of confidence in me. When I was around him, I had confidence in myself. So Wirt Gammon has left us, but he will live on in the hearts and memories of those who knew him best. So I always talk about my grandfather as being very influential to me in my writing, and because he was a journalist, I'm wondering what he would think about journalism today. Obviously, I think that journalism has taken a huge nosedive, and people don't really trust the news anymore. They don't trust journalists. There was a period of time where journalism and journalists were held in very high regard, and today not so much. As a journalist, I try very hard to get the story correct, get it straight, and have a long list of where I got my sources. Sometimes I understand that sources need to be protected, and journalists do protect their sources even if they have to go to jail, and some of them have. Today, we don't trust our journalists, and journalism is so bad that a lot of times, if you want real, honest uh, stories, you have to go outside the United States because, again, they don't have any skin in the game, but our journalists here, they might. So, as a journalist, I try to be fair and balanced and straight down the middle. And it's really difficult because, again, what human is not going to take sides. It's perfectly human and natural to want to pick and choose sides. It's really in our DNA to do this, and it goes back thousands and thousands of years to be tribal. After all, we are a very tribal civilization, a very tribal species, and that is really in our DNA. So it makes it very difficult for journalists to be straight down the middle and not take sides. But for me, I'm going to tell my readers where I got my sources from. And if you ever read an article from SABR, the Society for American Baseball Research, you're going to see that most of these articles, they will tell you exactly where they get this information from. And those guys, those journalists at SABR, and even Professional Football Researchers Association, those guys are some of the best writers I have ever seen in my life when it comes to sports. Like they really have, they have it cornered. I wish that our regular news media would do such a good job. One thing that really bothers me about the news media, and actually there's a few things, but I think one of the biggest things is the bobbleheads on TV. They're giving you information in 20-second sound bites, and you can't get all the information you need to form an opinion in 20 seconds. It doesn't happen. There's a lot of cases where the story is so large that you need to kind of break it down and dissect it, and it's going to take a lot more than the 20 seconds that the bobblehead on TV is going to tell you. And then the other thing too is the printed news media. So a lot of people now, they're not even reading the articles. They're just reading the headlines or the bylines, and they're not even reading the articles. In a lot of cases, the editors aren't even making edits to these articles if they're wrong. And it used to be that you'd have to have a correction in the press, in the paper, if your article was wrong, and they're not even doing that. The other thing too I'm finding is that there's a lot of mistakes that are being made that the editors are not even catching because they want things out now, now, now. But again, one of the problems here, if it's online, is that this stuff is not even worth the printed word, and it's like maybe a paragraph. And a lot of times too, you could have unrelated dialogue, if you will, in an article. So unfortunately, a lot of times you may be reading something about, like, say, the Red Sox or the Patriots, and somehow, some way, Donald Trump or Joe Biden or whoever, some political figure is going to be inserted into that article. And, that's not why you read the article. Who cares about politics? If you're reading a article about sports, not everything is about politics. And I try very hard to stay away from current politics. Uh, when you're dealing with a lot of the stuff surrounding the T206s or tobacco cards or even cards from the 1930s, that becomes a little bit more difficult because now you're dealing with the way that these cards were actually issued, and it was issued through legislation and it died through legislation, specifically our tobacco cards. Now, with the cards from the 1930s and the Great Depression, that's economic, and that has to do with legislation as well. And so that it becomes now a historic uh, fact, an historic argument to be made. Whenever I talk about a historic political figure, I'm doing so in context of that sports card or that sports set and how and why it became rare. Because sometimes we might not realize that the card set was issued because of political legislation, and it is the only reason why. And a lot of times too, or most of the times, I would say that everybody involved in, say, like the T206 formation, or say the 1933 D Long or the 1933 Miller set, the people responsible for those cards, the legislation portions of those, they're all dead. That generation is dead, long since dead. So nobody remembers Woodrow Wilson or William Howard Taft or Teddy Roosevelt, or very few people remember FDR. And so, um, we're 3 or 4 times removed from those societies that, and their cares and their worries, their hopes and their fears are not ours today. So you have to kind of like keep that in mind. Now, obviously, everybody has something to say about politics today. I don't care. Um, I I don't see the need for politics today. I really don't. I don't like politics. I don't like anything that goes on about it today. And this is one of the reasons why I gravitate towards sports cards, to get away from this stuff. And I think it's one of the reasons why, say, my grandmother's generation, my grandfather's generation went to the movies so they could get away from the everyday Great Depression stuff that was going on when they were kids. And I think it's one of the reasons why movies back in, and even sports back in the Great Depression, were so popular. You saw a huge boom in the 1930s and early 1940s because of what was going on around them. So uh, I always kind of like take this in mind whenever I'm writing about sports cards and politics. So you can read a lot of Wirt Gammon's articles in things like newspapers.com, which actually I have a subscription to, and I have read and followed some of his newspaper clippings. It's one thing to find this stuff. It's a little bit easier in say newspaper.com, but it's something completely different when you're trying to actually locate and track down some of his hobby writing, which is a lot more difficult because a lot of our hobby news articles and publications are not digitized the way most newspapers are now, although you do still have a lot of gaps missing in the historical press timeline, if you will. Not every day is obviously going to be saved, and the digitization process itself takes time. So I would say now that maybe 40 to 50, maybe even 60% of all newspapers are digitized, and that number is growing, but we still don't have a, a complete historical timeline of our hobby and the digitization process of articles and hobby publications. It's spotty at best. it's really going to give you just a little bit here, a little bit there. But you can find a few of his articles, and that's why I really like Dave Kathman. What he did was that he ended up posting a few of the stuff, and this is one of the things that I really enjoy. I think more than or equal to trying to find sports cards for my own collection is trying to piece together hobby history. And you're not just looking at hobby history here. These are people, after all. We are we are collecting cards of people who played a game and made people happy for the most part. Not all the time, but it's also Americana as well. And so it's what makes the country what it is. Sports does, and this baseball. I always say it mirrors American society at any given era, and what you're seeing on a card kind of demonstrates that as well. If you think about it, when you look at a T205, for example, from 1911, you're looking at what was going on in 1911 and the 1910s, and what you're seeing is not just the ball player, you're seeing the design that is specifically Art Nouveau. So when you're looking at the T205, you're looking at Art Nouveau and that period of design and what that represents. And that is throughout the 1910s. And we still have examples of this now today, almost like 100 plus years after. And then you also have, Art Deco came after that, and that's on our 1934 Diamond Stars, and what did Art Deco represent to the country? So we're looking at design as well as who is on the card itself, and for a lot of people who collected those cards, those could be specific memories for them, just like it is when I pick up a 1987 Topps Tiffany or whatever. I try to throw those things away. No, I'm just kidding. They're 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 all over the place. They were all over the place when I was a kid. So when Wirt Gammon said that the T206s, he could find them on the ground when he was walking to school or wherever he was going in town. He'd see them all over the place. And he's not the only one who actually said this either. John D. Wagner had also stated too that he could find piles of T206s on the ground, and sometimes a fight would ensue to get those cards. And so that's kind of like a common theme for the tobacco era, the T206s especially, which there was a huge craze at the time, and it did make the press quite often, in fact. So we do have press accounts of what is now known as the T206. Back then, it wasn't called T206. Those were actually called picture cards. So Jefferson Burdick needed a way to have a prefix system so he could send them to the Metropolitan Museum of Fine Art and they could catalog these cards. Otherwise, it'd be extremely difficult to know what they had on hand. And that's why you have this prefix system. It changed a little bit from like 1935 through 1946. Um, by 1946, he had everything kind of like planned out, and I think most of his collection was there. And then obviously he did this on the side too when he was working, and then he retired in like 1959. And you could see him a lot of times. He had his own desk at the Met, and he had an assistant as well. And then that's just all he did. So I thought this would be really interesting. Some of our hobby pioneers are not really known today, and I wanted to kind of change that. I think these guys are really important to establishing the hobby as we know it today. Otherwise, we wouldn't have a hobby. And if we did, it would be something maybe completely different than what we know of it. And obviously, Wirt Gammon is he's a name that and there's not too many people actually know about, but he's right up there with Lionel Carter. And Lionel Carter is actually he's really well known. In fact, he's one of the last known surviving members of that group that included Jefferson Burdick. It's kind of funny too that Lionel Carter, we know a lot about what he collected because his cards are now in the hands of multiple collectors. You can find a card of Lionel Carter's compared to Wirt Gammon, where we're not really sure if he collected cards. I'm pretty sure he did. I just don't know what he collected or what he had in his collection, other than a T206 Honus Wagner. He also again he had a very long career as an established writer for a newspaper, but again his hobby writing is we don't have a complete picture of it. It's not really well documented, I should say. Trying to find hobby publications is not the easiest thing in the world. I would love to get a complete record of our hobby publications on either file or something for a quick access to historians and see how our hobby has changed. Uh, and it's changed quite a bit, in fact, especially over the last 40 years. Our hobby has really taken off in ways I think that would surprise Wirt Gammon here or Lionel Carter. And in fact, Lionel Carter actually was very surprised about the direction of the hobby was taking, and he wrote about it on several occasions. Buck Barker also wrote about the change in the hobby as well in like 1962. The values were of the T206s were going up, so he was paying like 25 cents. The funny thing here is that when I was in high school, I could buy T206 commons for like $5 a piece, which I did a lot of. And then you could buy a lot of like Hall of Famers fairly cheap too. I think at one point I was paying like $40 for Hall of Famers. And I've heard stories too where older collectors were paying like really cheap money for like Ty Cobb back in like 1980 and stuff. And so what I think is really kind of interesting too, if you guys are into like T205s and T206s specifically, is that prior to like say 1980, there wasn't a lot of so like prior to like 1980, there wasn't a lot that was known about the backs of the cards specifically until Bill Heitman wrote his research paper on the correlation between the factory numbers and the rarity of the advertising on the back. He was really, I think, one of the first ones to do that. But other than that, I can't think of any other of our hobby pioneers that really dove into the subject of rarity in our tobacco cards, specifically the T206. And there's a lot still that needs to be done with the T206s. And I know that the T206 is probably one of the most heavily researched tobacco card sets of the 20th century, and we still don't know everything about it. There's still gaps in that history, but somebody had to come with some kind of knowledge somewhere. And Jefferson Burdick and Wirt Gammon, they were kind of scratching the surface of this set. They knew that these cards were banned at one time, but they didn't know exactly how, when, or where. And that's particularly because these guys were like 10 years old or 5 years old in Wirt Gammon's case when the set came out, and they were collecting these cards back in the 1930s, some 25 years later. So as Jefferson Burdick had famously said, I think, that he couldn't go to anybody to ask for information about these cards because nobody was around. And the generation below him, or after him, I should say, the greatest generation, they weren't even born. So that would be Lionel Carter's generation or my grandfather's generation. So they weren't even born. And if they were collecting cards, it would have been like in the 1940s. And it's funny too that in the 1940s, the biggest sellers were your end cards, your 19th century cards. Those were really hot back in like 1940, 41, 42. Jefferson Burdick actually, and he had to start the checklist which Wirt Gammon had said there were no checklists. So Jefferson Burdick and a few other guys had to find every single card in the set, and then they'd like make checklists and they'd go back and forth through the mail. I have this card. I need this card. Does this guy have a card? When did this card get released? They had to figure all this out by themselves and then come up with a master list of who was in this set. And for the most part, they got most of the stuff down between 1938 and 1942 when these checklists started to appear. And there were still cards at least in I think the 1950s and 60s that there was still a checklisting, and then there were some cards in the T206 that were taken out of the checklist, and there was a back that I think this guy Mayer had told Jefferson Burdick it was not a back at all, and he was playing a prank on him. But other than that, there it took him like years and years to do these checklists. And it's amazing too because Jefferson Burdick said, "I have no idea how many card sets are out there or cards," and so he had to have other guys go and help him out with this, and he wasn't really into baseball at all. So he had Buck Barker and Lionel Carter do a lot of the research on the players and on the cards themselves. So like Buck Barker, he comes along in like the late 1940s, but even before that, Lionel Carter and Harry Lillian, he's in the hobby a little bit in like the late 1930s and early 1940s, and then Lillian goes off to fight in World War II in France, and then by like 1946, 47, 48, he's out of the hobby, and he's more known for auctions, right? So he does a lot of the first auctions along with Charles Bray. He's not really well known either, and then you have throughout the entire, I guess, history of the founding of the hobby, there's Lionel Carter, who is doing the majority of the legwork, along with Buck Barker, because those two guys knew a lot about baseball. And what Lionel Carter used to do was he used to have the person send him cards, but he also wanted clippings, news clippings of the ball players as well. So he was a fairly learned guy when it came to baseball, and he was essential for establishing the hobby. And I think also too maybe Wirt Gammon, but again we don't have all of Wirt Gammon's material, his articles for hobby publications. I wish we did. I would have loved to have learned how these guys came up with uh, or postulated their theories on the rarity of some of these cards and how these cards were collected and how they were saved and all this other good stuff that we're now trying to figure out or kind of like follow in their footsteps. Sometimes we just have to relearn this stuff, which I think a lot of generations have to do naturally, because the one thing that I've learned throughout my time in the hobby is that when I was a teenager, there were no hobby articles that I could go to about some of these vintage players and vintage cards. And there wasn't really anyone to tell me about them. I had to learn this stuff on my own and go to the libraries and try to research this stuff. But again, where do you start when you don't know where to start, right? So I I really thought this was very interesting, and along the lines of my own hobby journey here, it's just not about sports cards. So I come from a kind of a long line of newsmen, if you will. So my grandfather and my great grandfather worked for the Evening Democrat in Iowa, and I'm not even sure that newspaper is still around, but it was back in the 1940s and the 1930s when they were in the media, and so I wanted to follow in their footsteps, especially my grandfather. Real big influence on me, and from what I've actually heard, that my great grandfather was a sports journalist first, and I think my grandfather, he covered some crime, and he did a lot of general interest stuff as well. But he had a fairly fairly good career in journalism prior to World War II. But I wanted to follow in their footsteps, and I have, and it's been really interesting. So for me personally, being in the hobby has been a real eye opener. It's been a really great education, and it's just not about collecting sports cards, as you guys can see in the back. That's fun too. It really is. It's the thrill of the chase, the thrill of the hunt. You never know what you're going to find in the hobby and what the stories are behind some of the cards. So I'm probably going to do a full length long form article on Wirt Gammon at some point in time. There's a lot of hobby pioneers that I'm still researching. These guys are not easy to research either. A lot of times they don't have articles or they don't have photographs, so you can place a name with a face. And some of these guys are just not well known today at all. Wirt Gammon, I think he's still well known, but only in certain circles. Let me know what you think about Wirt Gammon or anything else I talked about in this video, and I will talk to you in the next one. Have a good one. Bye.